For nearly 2 centuries, the world shook with the thunder of armies marching under the sign of the cross. From the hills of France to the deserts off the Levant, tens of thousands left their homes, driven by faith, greed, desperation, or glory. What followed was a clash that reshaped not only Europe and the Middle East, but the course of world history itself. This is the story of the Crusades, an age of blood and belief, of kings and popes, of knights and sultans. Between 1096 and 1291, Christian Europe launched wave after wave of armed expeditions into the Muslim-controlled Holy Land, seeking to reclaim Jerusalem, the city of Christ, and to defend the faith. But in their wake, they left a trail of tragedy, transformation, and an enduring legacy that still echoes through our modern world. To understand why the Crusades began, we must first step into the world of the 11th century. Europe was a continent both fractured and fertile. Lords and knights fought endlessly in feudal rivalries. The Church, however, stood above it all, its influence stretching across kingdoms. At the head of Christendom was Pope Urban II, whose word could unite princes and peasants alike. Meanwhile, in the east, the Byzantine Empire on the mighty eastern half of Rome was under severe pressure. The Seljuk Turks, a rising Muslim power, had inflicted devastating defeats on Byzantine armies, most notably at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The Byzantines, desperate to hold back tide, turned to the west for aid. But beyond politics, there was faith. To medieval Christians, Jerusalem was the very heart of the world, the city where Christ had lived, died, and risen. Control of this sacred place had long shifted between powers, but by the late 11th century, it rested firmly in Muslim hands. Though Christians were often allowed to visit, reports sometimes exaggerated, sometimes real spread in Europe of pilgrims harassed, holy sites desecrated, and churches destroyed. When the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent envoys to the Pope, requesting soldiers to help reclaim lost lands, he could not have imagined the storm he was unleashing. In November 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon that would set Europe aflame. Standing before nobles, knights, and clergy, he called upon the faithful to take up arms and liberate the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. God wills it, Deus vult, the crowd cried. Those who joined this holy cause were promised not only earthly glory, but eternal salvation. The Pope had declared that the sins of crusaders would be forgiven if they died in battle for the faith. The message spread like wildfire across Europe. Peasants, knights, and princes sewed crosses onto their garments, symbolizing their vow. This was not just a war, it was a pilgrimage with swords. The first wave that set out was not an army of knights, but an unruly horde of peasants, zealots, and outcasts, later called the People's Crusade. Led by figures like Peter the Hermit, they surged eastward in disorganized bands. Lacking discipline, they clashed with local populations and were ultimately massacred by Turkish forces. But soon came the real armies, seasoned knights and nobles from across Europe, and such as Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Godfrey of Bouillon. And like the ragged mobs before them, these were disciplined warriors, hardened by battle. After years of brutal campaigning through Anatolia and the Levant, they reached their prize, Jerusalem. In July 1099, after a long and desperate siege, the Crusaders stormed the city's walls. What followed was a massacre that horrified even contemporaries. Muslims and Jews alike were slaughtered. The streets, as one chronicler wrote, ran with blood. Out of this conquest, the Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and other Crusader states, fragile outposts of Western Christendom carved deep into the Middle East. For the first time, European knights ruled in the heart of the Holy Land. But the triumph of the First Crusade would not last. In 1144, the city of Edessa, one of the Crusader states, fell to Muslim forces. Panic swept Europe. A new crusade was preached, this time led by kings themselves, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Yet the Second Crusade was a disaster. Poor planning, supply shortages, and fierce resistance doomed it from the start. When the Crusaders reached Damascus, they besieged the city only to retreat in humiliation. The crusade achieved nothing, and its failure shook Christendom's consent. A new figure now emerged to unite the Muslim world, Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. Brilliant, patient, and devout, he consolidated Egypt and Syria under his rule. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin crushed the Crusader army and captured the relic of the True Cross. Soon after, Jerusalem itself fell into his hands. The shock was immense. The loss of Jerusalem struck at the very soul of Christendom. A new crusade was called the Third Crusade, led by the mightiest rulers of Europe, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Barbarossa drowned on the march. Philip quarreled with Richard and returned home, leaving Richard to face Saladin alone. What followed was a legendary duel of strategy and honor. Richard proved a masterful commander, winning battles at Acre and Arson. Yet despite his victories, he could not retake Jerusalem. Instead, in 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce. The Crusader states would remain, and Christian pilgrims would be allowed safe passage to the Holy City. Jerusalem, however, would remain in Muslim hands. The later Crusades grew increasingly desperate and increasingly corrupt. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, never even reached the Holy Land. Instead, driven by Venetian interests, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, the very city they had once sworn to protect. This betrayal deepened the rift between Eastern and Western Christianity. Subsequent crusades were smaller, fragmented, and often ill-fated, though there were brief successes. The tide had turned, the Muslim power had grown stronger, while the Crusaders were weakened. Finally, in 1291, the last Crusader stronghold, the city of Acre, fell to the forces of the Mamluks. With its collapse, the dream of Christian kingdoms in Holy Land was extinguished. The age of the Crusades had come to an end. The Crusades left a deep scar on both East and West. For Europe, they opened new horizons. Crusaders brought back not only relics, but knowledge. New ideas in medicine, mathematics, trade, and architecture flowed from the Islamic world into Christendom. Trade routes flourished, enriching cities like Venice and Genoa. Chivalric ideals of knighthood, the romanticized, drew inspiration from the Crusade experience. Yet the Crusades also left legacies of bitterness. The massacres in Jerusalem, the sack of Constantinople, and centuries of religious warfare hardened divisions between Christians and Muslims, Catholics and Orthodox. The echoes of this clash of civilizations resonate even today. The Crusades were an age of fire and faith, an era when men and women marched across continents, believing they could reclaim the holiest of cities by the sword. They won glories, suffered defeats, and forged legends. But in the end, Jerusalem remained beyond their grasp. What remains is not only the blood that was shed, but the memory of a time when faith moved nations, when popes and kings commanded armies in God's name, and when the world itself seemed caught between heaven and hell. The Crusades were not just wars of tempest. They were turning points in the shaping of our modern world. And though the knights and sultans are long gone, their shadows still linger, whispering of an age when the cross and the crescent clashed beneath the burning sun.